Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling something pretty massive, a plan to balance the U.S. federal budget. And not just balance it, but do it in 4 years.
That's right, 4 years. It's a bold goal, a really bold goal when you consider we're looking at a projected $1.6 trillion annual deficit.
I mean, is that even possible?
Well, that is what we're going to dive into today.
We're talking $30 trillion in national debt. It feels almost impossible.
I mean, it is a lot, but we're going to be looking at this plan, and it's pulled from a bunch of different sources that focus on bipartisan approaches to budget issues, so hopefully there's some, common ground in there.
Yeah.
So, is it feasible? I don't know. We'll see. That's what we're here to find out.
Right, and especially in this political climate, too, where it feels like everything is just so divided.
It's very divided. But there is historical precedent for this, for bipartisan budget deals.
Really?
Yeah, if you think back to 1990 and 1993, there were deals that involved both spending cuts and revenue increases.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So it's not unheard of. I think the real trick is finding that balance.
Yeah, a balance that can maintain support from both Democrats and Republicans.
Right, because if one side feels like they're getting the short end of the stick, the whole thing falls apart.
Right.
This particular plan focuses on the years 2026 to 2029. So let's jump into the first point of this plan, which is reforming Social Security and Medicare,
Okay.
but gradually, not like a sudden overnight thing.
Okay, so these are obviously two of the biggest programs in the federal budget,
Yes.
and they're, politically sensitive.
Incredibly sensitive.
Yeah.
So the approach here is to make gradual adjustments. So for Social Security, the plan proposes raising the retirement age to 68,
Okay.
but not immediately. It'd be phased in by 2030.
Oh, okay.
And it also suggests using something called chain CPI to calculate cost of living adjustments, what they call CLAs.
Okay, can you just break down chain CPI for me? I know we hear that a lot, but what does it actually mean?
Yeah. Chain CPI is a different way of measuring inflation. It takes into account how people change their spending habits when prices rise. Like, if the price of beef goes up, people might start buying more chicken instead.
Right. Makes sense.
Traditional CPI doesn't account for those shifts, so chain CPI tends to show a slightly lower inflation rate, which means smaller COAA increases.
Oh, okay. So you're basically slowing the growth of benefits to save money in the long run.
Exactly.
Gotcha. What about Medicare?
So for Medicare, the plan proposes gradually raising the eligibility age to 67. And it also introduces means testing for premiums.
Means testing, meaning?
Meaning that higher earners would pay more for their Medicare. Specifically, it targets the top 10% of earners.
So they'd be contributing more. It seems like this is trying to find that middle ground between, Democrats who want to protect those benefits and Republicans who are more worried about costs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about preserving the core programs, which is a big concern for Democrats, while also addressing those long-term solvency issues that Republicans always bring up.
And what kind of savings are we talking about here with these reforms?
Well, the estimates suggest that these changes alone could save $800 billion over 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on to the second point in this plan, capping and reducing discretionary spending.
Right.
It feels like cutting spending is always the go-to solution, but then when it comes down to it, no one can agree on where to cut.
Well, this plan tries to find that middle ground again. So it proposes freezing non-defense discretionary spending, NDD as they call it,
Right, NDD.
at fiscal year 2025 levels, which is about $800 billion.
Okay.
So basically holding the line there.
What about defense spending, though?
So for defense spending, it calls for a 5% annual reduction,
5%.
which is about $40 billion less per year from a base of about $850 billion. But it's important to note that these cuts aren't meant to cripple the military. It's about finding efficiencies and maybe reevaluating some priorities.
Okay, so if we're freezing non-defense, where are those NDD cuts coming from? What's specifically?
One of the big focuses is on eliminating waste, government waste,
I feel like we hear about that all the time.
all the time, but it is a real issue.
Yeah.
And the plan calls for targeting things like duplicative programs.
Oh, right.
Enter the Government Accountability Office,
Yeah.
the GAO.
Oh, yeah. They released those reports about all the government waste.
Exactly. And they've estimated that we could save about $100 billion just by streamlining those overlapping programs.
That's wild.
It is a lot of money.
Are there any areas that would be exempt from cuts? Like, I'm thinking veterans benefits or infrastructure investments.
You're right to ask that. The plan does exempt veterans benefits and key infrastructure projects. And again, this goes back to trying to balance the concerns of both parties. Democrats don't want to cut social programs, and Republicans are often more focused on trimming defense and the bureaucracy.
Okay, so finding those areas of agreement, basically.
Hmm.
And what kind of savings are we looking at from these cuts?
By taking this targeted approach, the plan projects about $600 billion in savings over the 4 years.
All right. Point number 3, increasing revenue. When we talk about tax reform, are we talking about tax hikes here?
Not exactly. This plan focuses more on reforming what are called tax expenditures,
Tax expenditures, meaning,
meaning like special deductions and credits that reduce how much tax people and corporations have to pay.
okay, loopholes, essentially.
You could call them that, like a discount at the grocery store, but built into the tax code. So the plan proposes limiting certain itemized deductions, like those for mortgage interest and charitable contributions, but only for high earners.
High earners being.
Individuals making over $250,000 a year.
Okay, so anyone below that wouldn't be affected.
Right. It would also cap the amount that employers can exclude from taxes for employee health insurance, which is currently unlimited.
Oh, interesting. And I'm guessing they are going after some of the usual corporate tax loopholes, too.
Oh, of course, got to target those corporations, right? This plan specifically targets things like offshore tax deferrals, where companies park their profits overseas to avoid paying U.S. taxes.
So again, it's like walking this tightrope trying to appeal to both sides.
Right, not raising income tax rates, which is a big no-no for Republicans,
Yeah.
but going after those deductions and loopholes that benefit mainly wealthy individuals and corporations, which is more in line with what Democrats want.
So how much revenue are we talking about here with these tax changes?
According to our sources, it could generate about $500 billion over the 4 years.
Okay, not as much as the spending cuts, but still a significant chunk.
Definitely helps.
All right. So let's move on to point number 4, which gets into potentially even more sensitive territory, reducing Medicaid and ACA subsidies.
Yeah, healthcare. Always a tricky one.
Yeah, because these programs help millions of Americans afford health care, so any changes are going to be controversial.
Absolutely. But the plan tries to, again, find a balance. So for Medicaid, it proposes moving to a per capita cap system.
What does that mean?
Basically, each state would get a fixed amount of money per Medicaid enrollee.
Oh, so instead of this open-ended funding, they'd have a set budget.
Right, and it would be adjusted for inflation. But the idea is to give states more incentive to find efficiencies and avoid waste.
Okay. And what about the Affordable Care Act, those subsidies?
So for the ACA, the plan suggests trimming those premium subsidies for individuals with incomes above 300% of the federal poverty level.
Meaning?
Meaning, if you're earning more than 3 times the poverty level, you might get less help with your premiums. But the plan emphasizes that it wants to keep coverage for those with the lowest incomes. It's about targeting those subsidies more carefully.
Okay, so the goal here, again, seems to be control the growth of these programs, which Republicans want, while still protecting the most vulnerable, which is a Democratic priority. Okay, so on to point number 5. Cutting the federal workforce and streamlining government. It feels like this comes up in every discussion about cutting costs.
Oh, yeah. It's a classic. But this plan suggests reducing the federal civilian workforce by 15%.
15%? That's a lot.
It is, but they're not talking about mass layoffs. It would mostly be achieved through attrition.
Attrition meaning?
Meaning not replacing people who retire or leave.
Oh, okay. So a more gradual approach.
Right. Less disruptive, too.
Are there plans to merge any government agencies?
Yeah, the plan proposes merging some overlapping agencies.
Sure.
Well, for example, they talked about maybe combining some functions of the education and labor departments.
Okay. Interesting. And what about those federal pay raises? Are those on the chopping block, too?
Not surprisingly, the plan calls for a freeze on federal pay raises for 2 years.
So again, it feels like they're trying to thread that needle, right? Streamlining government is something Republicans like, but doing it through attrition instead of layoffs might sit better with Democrats.
Exactly. Trying to find that common ground.
And it doesn't involve any, controversial agency closures or anything like that.
No? Keeping it simple, I guess.
And what kind of savings are we talking about here with these changes?
So they're estimating about $300 billion in savings over the 4 years.
All right, on to point number 6. Eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse across all programs. I feel like this is just a given, right?
It should be. I mean, no one wants to see their tax dollars wasted.
But how do you even begin to tackle that? I mean, it just feels so big and widespread.
It's a huge challenge, but this plan outlines a few approaches. First, it wants to strengthen oversight to try and cut improper payments in half.
When we say improper payments, what exactly does that mean?
It's basically money that goes out the door for the wrong reasons. Could be errors, could be fraud,
Okay.
deliberate abuse. And it happens a lot more than you might think. The CBO estimates it costs the government about $50 billion a year across programs like Medicare, Medicaid, even tax credits.
$50 billion a year, just wasted.
Yeah. And this plan aims to recover at least half of that through better oversight and enforcement. It also wants to claw back unspent funds from those big emergency bills, like the ones passed during COVID.
So just recouping money that was already allocated but not used?
Exactly. No one wants to see that money sitting around unused when it could be going towards reducing the deficit. And lastly, the plan calls for canceling what it calls low-priority programs.
Like outdated subsidies or things that just aren't working anymore?
Exactly. Sometimes the best way to save money is to just stop doing things that aren't effective.
Okay. And what kind of savings are we talking about with these measures?
Well, by combining all of these approaches, the plan estimates about $200 billion in savings over 4 years.
All right. Last point. Point number 7. Raising excise and user fees. This is where it gets a little controversial.
Well, this is where people start to feel it in their wallets.
Right. Because we're talking about things like raising the gas tax or increasing fees on airline tickets.
Yep, those are the usual suspects. But this plan tries to take a more targeted approach. So instead of those broad-based taxes that hit everyone, it focuses on revenue sources that are tied to specific things, like using a certain good or service.
Okay, give me some examples. What kinds of fees are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, it proposes increasing the gas tax by 10 cents per gallon.
There it is.
But, and this is important, that increase would be adjusted for inflation.
Oh.
And the revenue would be specifically for funding transportation infrastructure, roads, bridges, public transit, that kind of thing.
So the logic is if you use the roads more, you contribute more to their upkeep.
Right. It also suggests raising those fees on airline tickets.
So again, you use the airports, you contribute to their cost.
Makes sense,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then there's the carbon fee, which is always a hot button issue. But the plan suggests a modest carbon fee, and it would only apply to large emitters, like power plants and big industrial facilities. And to address concerns about the impact on, low-income households, it would include rebates to offset any increase in energy costs.
So trying to make it a little more equitable.
Exactly.
Okay. And so by linking these revenue increases to specific uses, they're trying to make it more palatable to both sides.
Right. Republicans like those user fees, while Democrats tend to be more supportive of things like climate action and infrastructure.
So finding that compromise once again.
Finding that middle ground.
What's the estimated revenue from all these fees?
The plan projects about $150 billion over 4 years.
Okay, so we've gone through all 7 points of this plan. A lot to digest. But does it actually achieve its goal of balancing the budget?
That's the big question, right? And that is what we're going to be digging into in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned. Okay, so we've laid out all the different pieces of this plan, the 7 key points. But the big question is, does it actually add up? Does it really get us to a balanced budget?
Well, let's look at the numbers.
Yeah, crunch those numbers.
Yeah, because that's what really matters, right?
Yeah.
So according to the projections, based on our sources, it does actually get us there. In fact, it actually exceeds the goal slightly.
Really?
Yeah, remember we started with that projected $1.6 trillion deficit.
Right, in 2025.
In fiscal year 2025.
Uh-huh.
And this plan aims to bring that down to nearly zero by fiscal year 2029.
So that's a pretty dramatic reduction.
It is significant.
Yeah.
But of course, all of these projections are based on certain assumptions.
Like what?
Like, how the economy performs. The projections we're looking at assume a modest annual growth rate of 2%.
2%, okay.
Which is in line with what the CBO's forecast.
Okay, so assuming the economy kind of holds up its end of the bargain, this plan could potentially work.
Yeah, potentially. But, there's a lot that could happen between now and 2029.
Right, a lot of ifs. But let's break down those savings and revenue increases. What are the biggest pieces of that deficit reduction? Where are the big wins, so to speak?
Well, the biggest wins, so to speak, are definitely on the spending side. The cuts to entitlement programs, discretionary spending, and the federal workforce, those are projected to save a total of $2.3 trillion over 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a pretty substantial chunk of change.
Yeah, that's the bulk of it. What about the revenue increases? How much are those contributing?
So those revenue-enhancing measures, like reforming those tax expenditures and increasing those user fees, those are estimated to bring in an additional $650 billion.
Okay, so not as much as the spending cuts, but still significant.
Still significant, absolutely.
So all in all, we're looking at a total deficit reduction of almost $3 trillion over 4 years.
$2.95 trillion to be exact, which comes out to an average of about $738 billion a year.
Which is more than that $720 billion per year that we need, right?
Right. It is more than what's technically needed to completely eliminate that deficit.
Yeah.
And that's intentional. There's a little cushion built in.
Oh, interesting. Why? Why build in a cushion?
Well, a couple of reasons. First, there's the potential for what they call interest savings. When the government borrows less money, pays less in interest on its debt.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
So that's estimated to save about $200 billion over the 4 years.
So that's kind of a bonus. Anything else?
Yeah, the other reason for that cushion is just, being prudent. You always want to be a little conservative when you're projecting revenue, right? Because economic conditions can change, something unforeseen could happen, revenue collections could fall short.
Right. Unforeseen events, pandemic, anyone.
Exactly. So it's better to have a little wiggle room, just in case.
It's like budgeting for your household expenses. You always want to build in a little buffer, for unexpected costs.
Exactly. It's always good to err on the side of caution when it comes to finances.
Okay, so on paper, this plan looks like it could work.
Right.
It balances the budget in 4 years, accounts for potential economic hiccups, has some padding for unexpected costs. But what could go wrong? What are the potential downsides here?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. On paper, it looks good.
Right.
But in the real world, it's a lot more complicated. For one thing, all these projections, they're based on a lot of assumptions. We've talked about the economy, but you also have to assume that Congress actually passes the legislation and that all these different government agencies are actually able to implement these changes effectively.
Right, because government efficiency, it's not always a given.
It's a big if. And then there's the political reality.
Ugh, yes, politics.
Even if this plan was presented as some kind of grand bipartisan compromise, getting it through Congress would be a monumental task.
It feels like everything gets bogged down in partisan fighting these days.
And this plan touches on some very sensitive areas.
Entitlements, defense, taxes.
Some of the hot-button issues.
Okay, so maybe it works mathematically, but politically, big question mark.
A big question mark.
What about the impact on everyday people? I mean, this plan makes some pretty big changes to programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
Right.
Those are programs that people rely on. Are there concerns about how these changes might actually affect people's lives?
Of course.
Yeah.
Anytime you're talking about big changes to those programs, there are going to be consequences. For example, raising that retirement age for Social Security, that could force some people to work longer than they planned.
Right.
Delaying their retirement, impacting their quality of life.
And means testing Medicare premiums could mean that some seniors, especially those with higher incomes, end up paying more for their health care.
Right.
Which isn't ideal when you're on a fixed income. And that per capita cap system for Medicaid, that could lead to cuts in benefits.
Or stricter eligibility requirements.
Yeah, leaving some low-income folks without access to affordable care.
Potentially. So you have to weigh those trade-offs, right?
Right, because balancing the budget, that sounds good in theory, but it's important to think about the potential human cost, too.
Exactly. It's about balancing priorities. Is reducing the deficit worth the potential sacrifices that some people might have to make?
It's a tough question. No easy answers.
Not at all. It's complex.
Okay, so we've looked at the benefits, we've looked at the drawbacks. It could work, but there are a lot of ifs.
A lot of ifs.
But what happens after we balance the budget? What are the long-term implications of this plan?
That is a great question, and it's one that I think often gets overlooked.
Right, because balancing the budget, that's great.
It's an achievement.
But it's not the end of the story, right?
It's just the beginning.
So what comes next? What are the new challenges, the new opportunities that we might face once we achieve that balanced budget?
Well, I think the focus has to shift from deficit reduction to long-term fiscal sustainability.
Okay, so it's not just about balancing the books for 1 year or 2 years.
No, you got to fix the underlying problems.
Yeah.
You have to address those structural issues that drive the debt in the first place.
Like what?
Things like the rising cost of healthcare.
Yeah, healthcare costs.
Those entitlement programs.
Social Security, Medicare.
They're only going to get more expensive as the population ages.
Right. So we need a system that can withstand those future shocks, the economic shocks, the demographic changes, all of that.
Absolutely. You got to think long term. How are we going to pay for the needs of an aging population? How are we going to fund essential services, education, infrastructure? How are we going to ensure that we're not leaving future generations with this mountain of debt?
It's a big task. It feels overwhelming.
It's daunting, but we got to start thinking about these things now.
Right, we can't keep kicking the can down the road.
No, we can't. We need to have that national conversation about our priorities. Make some tough choices about where we want to invest our resources.
It sounds like balancing the budget is just the first step in a much longer and more complicated journey.
It is, but it's a journey we need to take. The stakes are too high to ignore.
Well said. So, to our listeners, I encourage you to think about the implications of this plan, not just the short term, but the long term, too. What are you willing to accept? What are you willing to sacrifice?
And what kind of future do you want to create for yourselves, your children, future generations?
Those are tough questions. But they're questions that we all need to be thinking about.
You all need to grapple with.
Because these choices that we make about our nation's budget, they're ultimately choices about our values, our priorities, our vision for the future. And that is what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. So stay with us.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive. This plan to balance the budget in 4 years. We've looked at the details, the numbers, the potential consequences.
We've talked about how it tries to find that middle ground between Democrats and Republicans.
Right, that bipartisan sweet spot. But even if it works, even if it's politically possible, there are still some big questions about what it means for us.
Right. About our values, about our priorities as a nation.
Because balancing the budget isn't just about numbers.
No. It's about making choices that reflect what we care about, what we think is important.
So let's talk about those choices. What are the trade-offs here? What are we potentially giving up?
Well, some of the biggest trade-offs involve those big entitlement programs.
Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are the ones. They help millions of Americans, but they also cost a lot of money.
Right, and this plan changes them quite a bit, doesn't it?
It does. Raising the retirement age for Social Security means testing those Medicare premiums, changing how Medicaid is funded.
Yeah, and those changes, they're meant to make those programs last longer, but they could also affect people's lives in some pretty big ways.
Yes, sir.
I mean, raising the retirement age, that could mean some people have to work longer than they planned.
Right. Maybe dip into their savings.
Means testing Medicare could mean some seniors have to pay more for health care.
Which isn't easy on a fixed income.
And changing Medicaid to that per capita system, that could lead to states cutting benefits.
Or making it harder to qualify.
Leaving some low-income families without that safety net. So there are some tough choices here.
There are. Balancing the budget, it often means trade-offs.
And those trade-offs, they have real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Right. We can't forget that it's people's lives. And this plan also calls for cuts to discretionary spending, including defense. What are the potential downsides there?
Well, cutting defense could mean a smaller military, fewer operations.
Maybe delaying new equipment?
Possibly.
Yeah.
And those decisions, they can impact national security.
Right. So it's a balancing act. We need to be strong, but we also need to be smart about how we spend.
Exactly. It's about finding that right balance.
And then there's the whole issue of government waste.
Oh, yeah. Always a favorite topic.
This plan tries to streamline things, get rid of programs that don't work, crack down on those improper payments.
All good things in theory. But is there a risk of going too far?
Right. Could we end up cutting things that are actually important, that people need?
It's definitely something to watch out for. Any cuts have to be strategic. You got to eliminate waste without hurting essential services.
It's about priorities, right? Deciding what's worth spending money on, what we can afford to cut.
And those decisions, they tell us a lot about what we value as a nation.
So let's talk about values. What are some of the big ones that come into play here?
Well, one is fiscal responsibility,
Okay.
meaning managing our money well, not leaving future generations with a ton of debt.
Right. Not passing the buck, so to speak. What else?
Fairness, the idea that everyone chips in, that the burden is shared.
That it's not all falling on one group.
Exactly. And then there's compassion,
Compassion, okay.
meaning taking care of those who need help, making sure everyone has what they need, healthcare, education, a roof over their heads.
So we've got responsibility, fairness, compassion.
3 big ones.
Yeah.
And they often clash. It's not always easy to balance them all.
Right. Because cutting social programs might save money, but is it compassionate? Raising taxes might be fair, but does it hurt the economy? It's complicated.
It's very complicated. There's no easy answer.
But we have to try to find that balance. These decisions about the budget, they affect everyone. They shape our future.
They really do.
So to everyone listening, keep thinking about this. What are your values? What are you willing to compromise on?
What kind of future do you want to see?
Yeah.
For yourselves, for your kids.
Those are the questions we all need to be asking, because these choices, they're about more than just numbers.
They are. They're about who we are and who we want to be.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope it's given you some things to think about.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep those conversations going. And until next time.
Tuning in today, for listening.